So in 1944, Roosevelt is elected to an unprecedented fourth term in office, again, largely using the national crisis of World War II as a crutch to get reelected. However, Roosevelt would not live to see the Allied victory in 1945. On April 12, 1945, shortly after his inauguration in January of that year, Roosevelt suffers a stroke and dies. His successor, Harry Truman, is faced with a decision that no other president had been faced with before, and that's the decision to use the bomb on Japan. Truman knew nothing about the bomb until the Secretary of War Stimson informed him that we had developed, quote, the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. So the bomb is a practical realization of the theory of relativity. The idea is that energy and matter are two forms of the same phenomenon, and that we could create an atomic reaction that transformed part of the mass of an element, either uranium or man-made plutonium, into energy. That energy could then be either harnessed and used for power or unleashed for destruction. In 1939, at the beginning of the war, Roosevelt received communication from Albert Einstein that Germany was working on an atomic device. Roosevelt responded by authorizing the Manhattan Project to develop a similar weapon in 1940. The weapon was in development throughout the period of the war and finally was successfully tested in July of 1945. The intention all along was to use the bomb, on Germany, but Germany had already surrendered by that point. When Truman learned that the weapon was developed, he was faced with the decision of whether or not to use it on Japan. Now, ultimately, we know that Truman made the decision to use the bomb. On August 6th and August 9th, respectively, American bombers flew over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, dropping on each a payload of one atomic bomb. The impact was devastating. Immediately, nearly every building in the cities were destroyed in an instant, and roughly 70,000 people in each city were killed instantly as well. However, the long-term consequences of the bomb were something that we learned of only gradually. Because of radiation, the death toll continued to rise for months after, reaching 140,000 people by the end of the year. This action, or rather these two actions, ultimately helped to force the surrender of Japan. Also on August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and sent Soviet troops to invade Manchuria, which was a portion of China that Japan had invaded earlier, back in the 30s. However, within a week, the Japanese had surrendered entirely to the United States. Now, the use of the bomb has had lasting controversy. More civilians were killed in this one instant than all of the U.S. military fatalities in the entire Pacific War. But despite this, we do have some justifications that were made for using the bomb. The first of these was the cost of lives of U.S. soldiers could be as high as 250,000 people if we were to have launched a conventional invasion of the Japanese mainland. And it was assumed that the Japanese would fight even more fiercely on the Japanese mainland than they had on the outer islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, islands where the fighting had been brutal for the United States. And we were hoping to avoid similar losses, although on a more dramatic scale on the mainland. Another justification was that the bomb was a weapon, and weapons are made to be used. We had no qualms about developing the weapon to be used on Germany, And so why should we not want to use it on Japan? The argument could also be made that we weren't really fully aware of just how much devastation we would be visiting on this enemy. Often there was criticism. Even at the time, there was some criticism, but afterwards, a lot of the criticism has centered around the cost of civilian lives. Japan was completely devastated by the war and already close to surrendering before the bomb was dropped. And scientists at the time that had worked to develop the bomb urged a demonstration of its power rather than an all-out attack. However, there is some contextual evidence for why this decision to actually use the bomb on the Japanese was easier to make at the time. During the Second World War, the practice of targeting civilian populations was actually quite normal. World War II was an example of a total war where every aspect of the society was at war. And that tended to mean that civilian populations were not exempt. Air assaults on civilian populations during firebombing raids in Dresden, in Germany, and in Tokyo had actually produced far more casualties, civilian casualties, than the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But another thing that made it somewhat easier to make this decision was the fact that the United States had worked hard to completely dehumanize the Japanese to the American population. And so in dropping these bombs, the Japanese were less people being exterminated than they were vermin or rodents. As you can see in these propaganda posters, the Japanese are often portrayed as rat-like, almost, with the fact that they have claws and the kind of pointy ears and teeth. It's almost like a kind of a cross between a rat and a bat. These posters are all generally aimed at material conservation. This poster goes so far as to even portray a Japanese rat caught in a trap. The idea is that this is part of rationing, and the Japanese were almost seen as our primary enemy in the Second World War because they had actively assaulted the United States. Images like this made it really easy for Americans to not see the Japanese as a people, but rather as a problem that needed extermination, like we might look at mice in our house today, or even at the time. And so these kind of efforts also made it a lot more easy to justify the use of the bomb. Whether or not the bomb was a good idea is perhaps up for debate. But regardless of that, on August 9th, very shortly after the dropping of the second bomb, Japan surrenders to the United States on what is noted as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day. This is, of course, the formal end to all fighting in the Second World War. And in our next video, we're going to look at just how the world looks after the Second World War and how we're going to shape the world in the way that we want it.